Morning, my son-in-law reached across the breakfast table and poured coffee into my mug without being asked. I almost didn't notice. It was such a small thing, the kind of thing a thoughtful person does. But my daughter was watching me from across the table, and when I looked up, she set her fork down twice against the rim of her plate. Slow, deliberate, then picked it up again, like nothing had happened. I kept my face still. I've had practice with that. My name is Grant Holloway. I'm 58 years old. For 26 years, I worked as a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice in Raleigh, North Carolina, specializing in behavioral patterns and what the textbooks call coercive control dynamics. In plain English, I spent more than 2 decades sitting across from people who had been manipulated by someone they loved, helping them understand what had happened to them and why they hadn't seen it coming. Retirement came 14 months ago, a shoulder surgery that turned into nerve damage, that turned into the end of a career I hadn't finished grieving yet. My wife Margot passed 6 years ago, ovarian cancer. We had 29 years together, and the last 14 months of them were the ones that showed me who she really was, not the laughing woman at parties, not the fierce advocate at school board meetings, but the person who held completely still in the center of terrible news and just kept deciding to be present. I think about her every day. I think about her especially in moments when I need to read a room and trust what I'm reading. My daughter Ali is 31. She teaches yoga and runs a small wellness studio she built from nothing over 4 years, which tells you almost everything about her. She has her mother's stillness and her grandfather's jaw, and a laugh that sounds like she's surprised every time something is funny. She was careful with people after her first serious relationship, a man named Derek who turned out to be very different at home than he was anywhere else. That relationship lasted 2 years, too long, and left marks she worked hard in therapy to understand. After Derek, she was deliberate, unhurried. She said once, sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday, that she'd rather be alone than be wrong again. So when she called me last October to say she'd met someone and that her voice had that particular likeness I hadn't heard in years, I paid attention. His name was Blaine Mercer. He was 38. He'd moved to Raleigh from Atlanta 18 months prior, he told her, to take a regional sales director role at a medical device company. He was fit in the way that signals discipline, not vanity. He drove a sensible car. He texted back within reasonable windows. He brought flowers the first time he came to her studio and left a 5-star review that mentioned specific things about the class, not just the generic language people use when they're not paying attention. She brought him to my house for the first time at Thanksgiving. Just the 3 of us, because that's how we'd done it since Margot. I make her mother's sweet potato casserole badly every year, and Ali brings the pie from the place on Glenwood she's been going to since college, and we eat too much and watch football and don't talk about missing her even though we always are. This year, there was a 4th chair. I'd pulled it from the back bedroom the night before and stood there, holding it for a moment longer than I needed to. Blaine arrived on time. He brought a bottle of wine that was good without being showy, which is a choice, and he shook my hand with exactly the right pressure, which is also a choice. He commented on a photograph of Margot on the bookshelf, asked about it without waiting for me to mention it. And when I told him she passed, he said he was sorry and let the silence sit for a moment before moving on. He didn't fill the air with noise to cover his discomfort. That was the right instinct, or it looked like it. Dinner was easy in the way that skilled people can make things easy. Blaine asked questions and listened to the answers and remembered details from earlier in the conversation to connect later, which is the hallmark of someone either genuinely curious or professionally trained to seem that way. He and Ali had a comfort together that was visible, the kind of ease you can't manufacture in the early months. She relaxed around him. She laughed. We were about halfway through the meal, the casserole mostly gone, football on low in the background, when Blaine turned the conversation toward me. He asked about my practice, about the work I used to do, and I gave him the version I give most people: general, accessible, not the part that sounds like I'm sizing them up. He nodded and said that work must take a toll, being inside other people's pain all day. I said you learn to carry it differently over time. He asked a few more questions, good ones. And then Ali set her fork down against the rim of her plate. Twice. And picked it up again. I reached for my water glass, took a sip, set it down. We'd created that signal when she was 11, right after Derek's predecessor, a boy at school who'd started finding reasons to be wherever she was, in a way that frightened her, without her being able to name why. I told her, if you're ever somewhere and something feels wrong but you can't say it in front of the person, give me the signal and I'll know. We'd agreed on 2 taps with whatever was nearby, because 3 felt theatrical and 1 could be an accident. She'd never used it. In 20 years, she had never once used it. I didn't change my expression. 30 years of sitting across from people in pain teaches you to hold your face like still water. I looked at Blaine and asked him what part of Atlanta he was from. He said, Buckhead. I asked if he missed it. He said he missed the food more than anything, laughed a little, and Ali laughed too, and her hands were folded in her lap, and her jaw was set in a way I recognized from her mother. Holding something in, managing something. I spent the rest of that dinner being the most interested I've ever pretended to be. I asked Blaine about his company, about the medical device sector, about how he'd found the transition from Atlanta. He was fluent and specific. He mentioned a regional office in Durham, a VP who'd recruited him personally, a product line he was proud of. I filed everything. I smiled and passed the bread and let him like me because I needed him to like me. After dinner, Ali and Blaine took a walk around the neighborhood, a thing she'd apparently started doing with him after meals. I stood on the back porch with the cold air coming off the yard and called a colleague. His name is Terrence Webb. I stopped myself. His name is someone I'd known since graduate school, a man who spent 15 years doing forensic psychological evaluations for the court system before moving into private consulting, the kind of work that requires you to know how to find out who someone actually is. I called him from the porch at 8:47 at night, and he picked up because he always picks up. I said, I need you to look into someone for me, quietly. His name is Blaine Mercer. He says he's a regional sales director at a medical device company in the Durham area. He's dating my daughter, and something is wrong. A pause. How wrong? I don't know yet. That's why I'm calling you. He called me back 3 days later. I was in the garage, going through boxes of Margot's books that I'd been meaning to donate for 2 years and hadn't when the phone rang. Grant, he said, what do you know about his employment history? My chest went flat. Tell me. Blaine Mercier had worked for a medical device company, past tense. He'd been terminated 14 months ago, right around the time he allegedly moved to Raleigh for the job, following an internal audit that flagged irregular expense submissions. The company hadn't pursued it criminally. They'd let him go quietly and eaten the loss rather than endure the process. He was still listed as a regional sales director on LinkedIn because no one had made him change it, and the company had a policy of not providing detailed references, which meant a simple call to HR would produce nothing useful. But that wasn't the part that made me sit down on the garage floor. In the 2 years before the termination, Blaine had been in 2 serious relationships, both with women whose fathers or family members had money. The first was a woman in Savannah whose father owned a chain of urgent care clinics. The relationship had lasted 14 months, ended when the father discovered that Blaine had borrowed $22,000 from his daughter for what he described as a short-term cash flow problem while waiting on a commission check. The woman had not pursued it legally because she loved him, and because he'd convinced her it was an embarrassment to her judgment, not a crime. The father had paid a lawyer $1,500 to send a letter that accomplished nothing. The second woman was in Charlotte. Her mother was a retired hospital administrator with a pension and a settled estate. That relationship had lasted 10 months. The mother had grown suspicious when Blaine began asking detailed questions about her mother's investment portfolio during family dinners. She'd mentioned it to her daughter, The daughter had defended him. The mother had not pushed. The relationship ended. Blaine ended it. 2 weeks after the mother made clear she'd be keeping her finances separate. In both cases, he'd done nothing technically illegal that could be easily proven. In both cases, the pattern was the same: warm, attentive, accelerated intimacy, slow introduction of financial conversation, gradual cultivation of trust with the family member who held the money. "He's fishing," my colleague said. "Your daughter is the vehicle. You're the actual target." I thought about Blaine asking about my practice, about what I used to do, about his attentiveness at dinner, about the specific way he'd said I must have savings set aside, phrased casually, toward the end of the evening, in a way I'd noted but hadn't followed. I'd almost let it go as small talk. I thought about Ali setting her fork down twice. "I need to do this carefully," I said. "You know what happens when you go straight at them," he said. She defends him. You become the problem. He uses it to isolate her. I knew. I'd explained that exact mechanism to patients more times than I could count, had drawn the diagram on a whiteboard, had watched people nod like they understood and then go home and do the opposite because the heart doesn't work on the timeline the brain recommends. "Give me 2 weeks," I said. "I want to explain something here, because I think it's the part that's hardest to understand from the outside." Ali wasn't naive. She was a 31-year-old woman who had already survived one bad relationship, who had done real work in therapy, who ran her own business and managed her own finances and was, by any reasonable measure, a clear-eyed adult. None of that made her immune. The reason none of that made her immune is that Blaine hadn't targeted her naivety. He'd targeted her healing. She'd spent years learning to trust herself again, learning to believe that her instincts were worth following, that she deserved someone who showed up consistently, that love wasn't supposed to feel like walking on ice. Blaine had simply learned to be that person, or to perform that person with precision. He'd done it before. He'd gotten better at it. By the time you're 6 months into a relationship that has delivered on every promise, the suggestion that it's all constructed feels less like a warning and more like an attack. That's not weakness. That's what makes these people dangerous. I called Ali on a Thursday, 3 days after I'd spoken with my colleague again and confirmed everything he'd found. I didn't mention Blaine. I told her I'd been thinking about Thanksgiving, about how nice it had been to have someone else there, that I thought I'd been too closed off about change and too slow to say so. I told her I'd like to have Blaine over again sometime soon, maybe just dinner, the 3 of us, more relaxed than a holiday. She was quiet for a moment. "Really?" "I liked him," I said. "I'd like to get to know him better." She sounded pleased in a way that made the next 2 weeks harder to get through. I spent that time preparing. I reached out to the woman in Savannah, Blaine's former girlfriend, through a mutual connection, very carefully, and spoke with her for an hour on the phone. She confirmed everything. She also said she'd been waiting for something like this call without knowing she was waiting. She said she would provide a written statement if it ever came to that. I said I hoped it wouldn't have to, but I appreciated her telling me. I called a family attorney I'd referred patients to over the years and asked her to be available for a consultation. I documented everything my colleague had found, organized by date and source, and I had a long, painful conversation with myself about how to do the next part without becoming the villain in my own daughter's story. The dinner was on a Saturday. Blaine brought wine again, same label as Thanksgiving, which told me he'd noted what worked. He was easy and warm and made a point of complimenting how I'd rearranged the living room. I hadn't, but I said thank you and watched him not realize his mistake, which told me something about how carefully he was actually paying attention versus performing attention. We ate. The conversation moved through the usual territories. At a pause between the main course and dessert, Blaine leaned back in his chair and said, in a voice that was relaxed and offhand, that he'd been doing some reading about retirement, investment restructuring, that with interest rates where they were, a lot of people in my situation were leaving money on the table by staying in traditional accounts. He said he had a friend who specialized in that kind of transition planning, that he'd be happy to make an introduction if I was ever curious. I looked at him across the table. "That's kind," I said. "Actually, I've been working with someone on that already. An old colleague of mine. She consults now for firms that, funny enough, specialize in exactly the kind of fraud that targets people in retirement transition. She's been very helpful." A beat. "She's very thorough," I said. "Old habits from her time doing evaluations for the court system. She tends to run the full background on anyone I'd be doing business with." I paused. "Or anyone adjacent to me, really. She thinks I'm too trusting for someone who spent 30 years in my field." Blaine was still smiling, but something behind the smile had changed. "I've spent 3 decades reading the half-second adjustments people make when they feel a room shift. I saw it." "Sounds like you're well looked after," he said. "I try to be," I said. Ali was looking at me. She knew something had happened. She didn't know what. Blaine wound things down naturally, smoothly, the way experienced people do. Suggested dessert another time, said he had an early call in the morning, thanked me warmly, kissed Ali goodbye at the door, shook my hand, drove away slowly. Ali stood in the doorway. "Dad," she said, "come inside." We sat at the kitchen table. I poured her tea. She'd stopped drinking coffee at night 2 years ago after it started affecting her sleep, a detail Blaine had somehow never learned, though she'd mentioned it in front of him twice. I made tea. I sat down. And then I told her. Not everything, not the full picture at once. I'd learned from my practice that information delivered in a flood looks like panic, and panic activates defense rather than understanding. I told her about his employment. I told her about his employment. I told her about the pattern. I told her about the woman in Savannah. Ali sat very still. It was her mother's stillness, the kind that isn't absence but concentration. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The fork," she said finally. "I didn't even fully know why I did it. Something felt off, and I didn't know what, and I remembered." She stopped. "I didn't know if you'd remember." "I remembered," I said. She pressed her palms flat against the table. "How long has the woman in Savannah, how long has she been sitting with this?" "About 2 years. Something moved across Ali's face. Anger, yes, but underneath it something more specific. Grief for a stranger she recognized. "What do we do now?" she said. "That depends on what you want," I said. "There may not be enough for criminal charges. The patterns are documented, but the direct fraud is complicated to prove legally. What we have is strong enough to protect you. It may not be strong enough to stop him permanently." She was quiet. "I want it to stop him," she said. "I don't want there to be another woman sitting with this in 2 more years." She reached out and put her hand over mine on the table. I thought of Margot's hand on mine in a hospital room, the night before she died, that same shape of touch that means I'm here and I'm decided. We spent the next month working through it together. The family attorney helped Ali document her own interactions with Blaine, the conversations where he'd asked about her studio's finances, the one time he'd suggested they open a joint savings account to see how it felt. Small things, but small things accumulate. The woman in Savannah connected us with a woman in Charlotte whose mother had grown suspicious. Her mother, now that she knew there were others, agreed to make a formal statement. 2 statements became 3 when the attorney located a 4th woman in Greensboro. Blaine had been there briefly before Charlotte, who had been too ashamed to talk about what had happened until someone called and told her she wasn't the only one. 4 statements, a documented termination, a paper trail of interactions that spelled out a pattern no reasonable person could read as coincidence. The attorney submitted everything to the North Carolina Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division and to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I don't know exactly where it stands as I write this. I know that Blaine Mercer doesn't know what has been filed, and I know that the woman in Savannah said she slept well for the first time in 2 years the night after she signed her statement. Ali took some time with herself in January. She came over most mornings that first week, brought coffee for herself and tea for me, sat in the kitchen without requiring the silence to be filled. We talked about her mother. We talked about Derek. We talked about the difference between a person's instincts failing them and a person's instincts being deliberately overridden by someone who's practiced at it. "I felt it," she said one morning. "I felt something was off. I kept dismissing it because everything else was fine. He did everything right." She paused. "That's what I kept telling myself. He does everything right. How do you argue with that?" "You don't argue with it," I said. "You ask yourself who benefits from you not trusting your own unease." She sat with that for a minute. "When did you teach me that?" she said. "Your mother said it first," I said, "about something else entirely. I wrote it down." Ali smiled, quick and surprised, the way she always smiles, like joy catches her off guard. In February, she started running a series of workshops at her studio. Boundaries and body awareness, she called it, for women who felt something was wrong and didn't have language for it yet. The first session had 14 people in it. The third had over 30. I went to the fourth one in the back corner, and I watched her explain in the clearest possible terms how a person's physical instincts register danger before their mind does, how dismissing that sensation is almost always a mistake, how a feeling of wrongness is worth the cost of being inconveniently right. Afterward, she found me in the parking lot. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," I said. She leaned against the car. The parking lot lights were on. The kind of winter evening that's cold without being dramatic. "I've been thinking about the signal," she said, "about using it and not even fully knowing I was using it." "What about it?" "I think that's the thing," she said. "The body knew before I did, and we'd made a system for exactly that, for when the body knows before you can say it out loud." "Your mother thought of it," I said. "She said children need a way to ask for help that doesn't put them in the middle of the thing they're afraid of." Ali was quiet. I forgot it was her idea. She had a lot of good ones. We stood there another minute. The cars in the lot were thinning out. "I'm going to teach it in the workshops," she said. "A version of it. Not for emergencies, but for the in-between moments. For when something feels wrong but you're in a room where saying so feels impossible." She looked over at me. "People need that. They need a way to signal without having to be certain." I looked at her. Her mother's jaw, her mother's stillness, her mother's particular form of turning a hard thing into something useful. "They do," I said. She drove home ahead of me. I stayed in the parking lot for a few minutes, the engine running, the heat coming up slow. I thought about a signal made in an ordinary kitchen 20 years ago. All the years it had sat quietly in both of us, like something folded and put away, and the one February morning it had crossed a breakfast table between two people and landed exactly where it was supposed to land. I tapped the steering wheel, twice, with 2 fingers. Then I put the car in drive and went home. I've thought about that breakfast table moment more times than I can count. The coffee. The easy conversation. Blaine pouring into my mug like he'd always lived there. And Ali, across from me, setting her fork down twice, without fully knowing why she did it. That's the part that stays with me. She didn't have a name for what she was feeling. She just knew something was off, and somewhere in her body, in whatever part of her stores the things we learned young, she remembered that we had made a system for exactly that. What Blaine had built over those months was genuinely impressive in the worst way. He hadn't targeted her weakness. He'd targeted her strength, the version of her that had done the hard work, learned to trust again, decided she deserved to be seen clearly. He found the place where she was most open and walked through it like he had every right to be there. That's not something you defend against with suspicion. You can't be on guard against someone who's specifically designed to feel like safety. What stopped it wasn't luck. It was 3 things working together, and I think about all 3 of them now. The first was character, Ali's. Not innocence, not caution, but something deeper. She had done the real work after Derek. She'd sat in a therapist's office and looked honestly at what had happened to her and why, and she'd come out of that process with a clearer sense of her own worth. When something felt wrong with Blaine, she didn't dismiss it completely. She couldn't explain it, she couldn't prove it, but she didn't bury it entirely either. She gave it enough space to reach across a breakfast table. A person who had never done that interior work might not have signaled at all. The second was knowledge, mine, and the years of experience behind it. I'd spent 3 decades watching manipulation operate up close. I knew what the pattern looked like before I had the evidence, and I knew that having a feeling wasn't enough. You have to build the case. You have to find what's underneath the feeling before the feeling alone will convince anyone, including the person you're trying to protect. That took patience, and it took method, and it required me to hold back when every instinct said to act faster. The third was will. Ali's again. Once she understood what she was looking at, she could have shut down. She could have been humiliated into silence the way the woman in Savannah had been, the way so many people are when they realize they were deceived by someone they loved. Instead, she wanted it on record. She wanted the women in Charlotte and Greensboro to know they weren't alone. She turned a painful thing into something that reached people she'd never met. None of it worked in isolation. Character without knowledge means you feel the danger but can't name it. Knowledge without character means you see the pattern but don't care enough to act, and neither one sustains anything without the will to keep going when it costs you something. Blaine counted on all 3 being absent. He was wrong about our family. The signal worked because Margot thought of it 20 years ago, and I remembered it, and Ali remembered it, and we had never stopped being the kind of people who meant it. That's not a small thing. That's everything.